We're glad to have you back. It came as a surprise when the central bank announced its plans to redesign the 200 naira, 500 naira, and 1000 naira notes. Reasons includes the bulk of the currency in circulation being outside the banking sector's votes, counterfeiting, and insecurity. The currencies have now been unveiled by President Muhammadu Buhari, and though a school of thought feels it is a necessary step, others, however, say it is ill-timed and should have been introduced earlier. My colleague Lara Afolayan in this report highlights the pros and the cons of this new policy.
The central bank's plan to redesign the 200, 500 and 1000 naira notes is to primarily mop up and have better control over funds in circulation. The Apex Bank says though 3.2 trillion naira is currently in circulation, 2.7 trillion, representing 85% of the total amount, is outside the banking system. The redesign initiative is now to help control inflation as well as fight counterfeiting and kidnapping by way of stopping cash payments for ransom.
The management of the CBN has sought and obtained the approval of President Muhammadu Buhari to redesign, produce, release, and circulate new series of banknotes at 200 naira, 500 naira, and 1000 naira levels.
The new notes have now been unveiled by the president, and the most striking thing about their new identity is the color, as the new notes still have the same design. Some are in support of the Apex Bank's decision. Others say the printing cost will put an avoidable financial strain on the country's scarce resources. They also think it is ill-timed, as it should have been done earlier.
Even though I welcome the idea of the changing our currency notes, which could have actually curbed inflation if it was done earlier, but the period that they are doing it now is having a very little effect.
We are grappling with an election period that are likely to be volatile. And we are now also at the same time bringing up such policy. Don't forget that 2023 will also be census year. This could have been done 2 years ago or 3 years ago, or wait till after our election.
Shortly after the Apex Bank's announcement of the naira redesign, the naira saw a free fall to an all-time low of about 900 naira to a dollar. But the naira now appears to have strengthened to about 775 naira to a dollar at the moment, owing to improved supply. The naira's weakness against the dollar has remained a huge concern for years, and the country is advised to be more productive and stop import dependence so as to strengthen its currency.
We need to be producing, we need to be exporting, we need to be creating. Nigeria, we are a consuming nation. So the more we consume, the more we are going down. We consume more than we produce.
The Apex Bank has said it will not extend the January 21st, 2023 date to end the use of the old currencies. The president at the currencies unveiling says it was printed locally by the printing and minting company and should help the country address challenges of illicit financial flows, corruption, and improve the value of the naira. The naira redesign is the first of its kind in 20 years. Lara Afolayan, TVC News, Abuja.
Well, being joined by partner, tax reporting and strategy with PricewaterhouseCoopers, Mr. Kenneth Erikume. Mr. Erikume, good afternoon. I'm sure you listened to that report. Were you able to hear my colleague?
Yes, hi Tolu. Yes, I got most of the points raised by your colleague.
All right. Now, my question would be, the central bank seems to have activated one of its core functions, which is management of the currency. Well, 17 years after the last one was done. What is your own reaction to this? Let me start on that note.
All right, thank you very much, Tolu. I think there are, based on the communication coming from the central bank, there are several reasons why they have done this. One of them is to curb inflation. Another one is to manage illicit flows. And of course, to manage things like kidnapping and banditry. So when you put all of these things together, there is some common sense principle that has been applied here, which is quite important. on the first issue of inflation, it may not be quite apparent that doing this is going to curb inflation, because the current inflation, some argue, is mostly a cost push inflation, which is largely driven by some of the global events like the Russia-Ukraine war, the disruption to supply chains from COVID and the likes, and then the pent-up demand that came after. And of course, the issue of our FX liquidity, which makes it very costly to import items, raw materials to manufacture. And we know we are a largely import-dependent country. So when the FX goes north, costs become higher in naira terms. So on the cost push side is where we have a large problem. But the response from central banks globally, managing cost push inflation, is quite complicated. And you see that many of the interventions locally here in Nigeria are actually on the demand side, where the supply of money competing for scarce resources is more than the resources. So when you want to manage demand pool inflation, one of the things you normally do is to manage the supply of money. And you would see that the central bank has not just reacted with managing the cash supply, but also managing the interest rates, because we've now moved it to 16.5, the monetary policy rate to 16.5%, which is the highest since 2001. Okay, so they're reacting to that. But supply of money is actually different from supply of cash. So if you implement this this change in the naira notes, not the denomination, but the change in the currency notes themselves, what you're trying to do is to manage cash supply. For people like you and many times do not use cash for transactions. So you're really not taking away our ability to compete for those cash resources. So it doesn't really change anything from that side. It is on the second two elements that I think that this policy could be successful, where you're now dealing with, payments for kidnapping, illicit funds, and corruption that have been outside of the banking system. And automatically you're putting pressure for them to either bring it to the banking system, which normally they shouldn't, or there would be a case for them not to bring it into the system. By so doing, you have managed the supply of money indirectly. So I think when you look at things holistically, it's very possible that this would lead to would help with management of inflation. Having said that, there needs to be in place a mechanism to ensure that those funds that are illegal do not find their way into the banking system. Otherwise, you would have achieved nothing in terms of managing inflation. So those are my thoughts around this. I think it will be more effective on the kidnapping side going forward, especially if the government has put in place proper monitoring systems, such that the serial numbers of this cash is well documented. And if people are making payments, illegal payments, finding its way back into the banking system becomes more difficult. When the government does that, I think we'll make traction in terms of security, and maybe to some extent with inflation.
But let me ask directly, what about impact? That's talking about the 16.5 rate now, where we stand with the MPR following the MPC meeting, the last one for the year. What impact will this 16.5% monetary policy rate have on businesses, borrowing, and of course, investors?
Okay, so what I didn't say, right? So maybe I didn't say it clearly. Now, some of these monetary policy measures may not really change more right? Because most of our inflation is coming from the cost push side. However, they could have an adverse effect overall on the economy. Because, really what you have essentially done, by increasing, so since the start of this year, we started the rate with an MPR of 11.5%. So we've added 500 basis points, it's now 16.5%. For someone who borrowed 100 million naira, the interest expense they have to incur has increased by 5 million naira per annum. So that would have a very adverse impact on manufacturers who have borrowed or businesses who have borrowed in order to make investments and turn out a profit. One of the things we are seeing with this inflation, you would notice, is that the disposable income of people is not changing. Just as the inflation is increasing, the levels of poverty has also been increasing. So it is now difficult for manufacturers to pass the cost, both from the inflation side and from the interest side onto the final consumer. So it is either they eat into their margin to continue to be in business because they cannot pass the cost to the consumer, or some of them would have to invariably close shop or look for alternative ways to make money. So it's really, really difficult at the moment. If your margins are, say, 10%, it is probably better for you to invest your funds and earn interest than to continue to produce your final product. And bearing in mind, there are other challenges of being in manufacturing in Nigeria, such as the issue of logistics, the issue of electricity and other infrastructure, which you need to incur additional cost to meet up with. So it's going to be a very complicated, because this is a sudden rise between 1st of January this year and now, that a lot of people who have mobilized funds in the form of borrowing would have to grapple with. And the effect would ultimately be that costs continue to go up. As you would see from the intervention in other countries, central banks have not been able to find a solution to the inflation problem. And I do not think that Nigeria will be any different, because we're part of the global economy. And funds are competing globally for resources. So Nigeria, I do not think that the increase of MPR would resolve the tide of inflation. And bearing in mind that we're going into an election year. What happens during an election year is twofold. Number one, there would be a lot of funds flowing to fund the election, both legally and illegally. And then you also have, of course, we need to clamp down on electoral malpractices, of course. But in addition, you also have some governors who are leaving and who want to do legacy projects. So they accelerate some of those legacy projects so that when they leave office, they're able to turn back and say, this was what I did. So when you look at that, and even the ones going for a second term, they want to be able to demonstrate to the people that they have delivered some things, or at least start some projects and show some traction. All of those things would mean more and more supply. And of course, the effect would have a cascading effect in terms of inflation. So I do not think that there's going to be a clear resolution by just increasing the rate and all that. So we're still in part of that global economy, and the cost push side, importing finished goods, importing wheat and grains. There is no way to tackle it. So nothing is going to change.
So operational costs continue to rise, and there's inability of investors to repatriate funds. That is something that is also very important, making companies and corporations leave the country. What does this mean for us as a country as we wrap up the year, where manufacturers are supposed to be producing, a lot of stuff's supposed to be happening?
Yes. So from an investor's outlook, right, it depends. So there are two things investors are looking at now. The first one is this the right time to make a strategic decision to come into Nigeria or to increase, my investment in Nigeria? Considering, the exchange rate and the opportunity to pick up, certain assets on the cheap. Okay, so there are some investors that are looking at that and they see opportunity from that perspective. Usually, if you make a calculated guess, sometimes when the economy is not exactly fantastic, when there is an upside, you would probably benefit from it. So that's perhaps one of the thinking there. But just to backtrack, for portfolio investors, this will not be an interesting time for them at all, because as you know, their investments will continue to lose significant value. So what you would tend to see is that some of those investments will find a home in other jurisdictions where there's more stability, but interest rates across the world globally is already high. So you might see some of those investors sticking with government bonds of jurisdictions with competitively high interest rates, but relatively more stable currency. So those are some of the things that I think from a global perspective and from an investment perspective we also need to think about. And as a country, we now need to start looking inwards. What can we do to continue to attract the investment, considering our current disadvantage? And we need to revisit and look at how we make doing business easier. And to be honest, these are some of the things I think we need to be doing to complement some of these monetary policy interventions from the central bank. One of the things you do, from a textbook perspective with inflation, is to cut cost of governance. But that will be very difficult to do. Or can we start making it a key performance indicator, for government offices to deliver services and deliver it on time, but in order to ensure that the private sector continues to thrive? We cannot continue to find ourselves in a situation where we are paying this large bill as recurrent expenditure. We are paying this large bill for debt servicing. When you put all of these things together, we are funding the public sector, but the public sector is not acting as an enabler for the private sector to thrive. You want your tax clearance certificate, it's a problem. You want your licenses, it's a problem. So we now need to look at a government that is value driven and value based. And if we can tweak that, that would be a significant change in dynamics. And if we can improve the ease of doing business, we may indeed retain some of these investments and perhaps attract a bit more.
Very interesting conversation, I must say. But in one word, before I let you go, the outlook is not looking so good. Yeah, like I said, the outlook not looking so good, considering all of these challenges. Do you think, in your thoughts, that there is this alignment, proper alignment, or exists between the fiscal and the monetary side? We've talked about this, I know, before now. What do you think it's really functional? Look at what happened during the announcement for the naira, actually a redesign of the naira. You know where I'm going. So what do you make of that?
Yes. I think for everyone, it's apparent that cohesion is required, and complementary effort where people are working together to achieve a common purpose is actually important in this very challenging period. it's not just challenging in Nigeria, we must say. It's actually challenging everywhere. But you need to have a good complement of fiscal policy and monetary policy to ensure that these initiatives are bearing fruit. And I gave one example of some of the things we can do on the government effectiveness side. But we also need to ask ourselves, from a fiscal policy perspective, have we explored some of the things we can actually use to manage inflation? And I'll give you an example. Another mechanism, we've spoken about supply of money, we've spoken about increasing interest rates, we've spoken about cutting costs of governance or making governance more effective. But there are other things that you can do. And one of the things that you can do is, managing price. So in other countries, when the cost of energy increased, fiscal policy came into play for managing price. Because in instances where, certain imports of commodities attracted taxes, they released those taxes and used it as a way to ensure that the price to the final consumer was at the same level, or at least managed to some extent. That is where fiscal policy can begin to play a role, in terms of inflation. Another thing we need to also think about is whether we need to restructure, from a tax perspective, maybe increasing personal income tax and cutting on corporate tax. Now, that is just hypothetical. What you need data to analyze what the best fiscal policy would be to give the best outcome. But if there is no conversation and there's no synergy between monetary policy and fiscal policy, that disconnect would mean that whatever you come up with will never be effective. So that's my last word on this point.
Mr. Kenneth Orikome, I must thank you so much. Partner Tax Reporting and Strategy, PricewaterhouseCoopers. Thank you so much for your time on the show. We appreciate your contribution.
Thank you very much, Tolu. Looking forward to chatting with you later.